explain Acts chapter 17 in verse 4, the leading women. The passage in Acts chapter 17, of course, Paul and Silas were on the second evangelistic journey. They were in the city of Thessalonica. They had gone into a synagogue and preached. And this verse says that some of them were persuaded. And they joined with Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. Literally in the Greek language, it could be translated the women of the first rank. But leading women certainly gets to the idea. And the question again is, so what exactly are these leading women? Before I answer the question, let me turn back a few pages in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 13. This is on the first evangelistic journey. Paul and Barnabas, this time in the synagogue of Antioch of Pisidia, and they had preached there. In this case, the Jews, though, this is Acts 13 and in verse 50, the Jews incited the devout women of high standing and the leading men of the city, and they stirred up a persecution against Paul and Barnabas. In both cases, we're looking at synagogues. And these women could have been Gentiles who were among what the Jews called the God-fearers. These were the ones that generally were not allowed access into the synagogue, but they congregated around the synagogue because they were God-fearing Gentiles. And so the scripture sometimes referred to them as the God-fearers, those who feared God. And so these could have been among that number. These could have been women who were proselytes and who had actually become Jewish in their belief and practice. Or these could have been Jewish women. It could have been any one of those groups, but none of that affects this idea of being one of the leading women. In both cases, the leading women there of Thessalonica in Acts chapter 17, or these leading men or devout women of high standing in Acts chapter 13, the thing that would make them leading women is that they were women who had money, and so they generally had a great deal of wealth. They were women who enjoyed a high social standing, and quite often those things would go together. They were women of great influence in the community, and of course those things quite often all go together. You got the money, social standing, and the influence. In the case of the women there in Antioch of Pisidia, they were, even though they were devout, they were stirred up against what Paul and Barnabas were preaching. But the leading women in Thessalonica that are described there, they paid attention to the gospel, and they were persuaded by the gospel. And so being one of the leading women didn't affect the fact that you either had a good heart or you had a heart that was not good. In one case, you had those who bought into the gospel. In one case, you had those who rejected the gospel. But again, the bottom line for these ladies is that was very common in that Greco-Roman society, that culture of the first century, that a wealthy woman or sometimes a wealthy man would become a patron of some particular cause. That is, they would underwrite it, they would finance it. And it might be a religious cause, as it would have been in this case. It could have been a civic cause or a philosophical cause or something like that. But they would become the patrons, and they would fund some cause or perhaps some person in some work that they were doing. You see this with some other women who are specifically named in the New Testament. And so you have, for example, Joanna and Susanna, who are specifically mentioned there in the early verses of Luke chapter 8. And the record tells us that they followed after Jesus, and they helped to support him and those disciples out of their own personal finances. These women appeared to have been leading women, women who were patrons of the cause of Christ. And so if you wonder, how did Jesus even eat? How did those 12 apostles even eat as they were going from town to town? Well, sometimes it's because women like this helped to support them in the work that they were doing. Lydia is very likely one of those leading women. She was a seller of purple, mentioned in Acts chapter 16 and in verse 2. A seller of purple meant that she sold the expensive stuff. Okay, she wasn't selling cheap jewelry on the corner of the street. She was selling purple cloth, which meant that she was dealing in high valued material. And she was probably, in all likelihood, a well-to-do woman. That she was a godly woman was evident because Paul and Silas found her with other women on the riverside there in Philippi, and they were praying to God there. So she was a godly woman. And then later on, when we read about the church at Philippi sending support over and over again to the Apostle Paul, as we do in the book of Philippians, you wonder, so who's putting the money in the plate back in Philippi? The jailer, maybe, probably, some. Did Lydia contribute to that contribution on the first day of the week that ended up being sent to the Apostle Paul? Yeah, I would say very likely. To the extent that she would be called a leading woman, I don't know, but she could have been. Phoebe in Romans chapter 16, depending on your translation, she is specifically referred to as a patron, a woman of some wealth, influence, and standing, who again used her influence in order to help further the cause of Christ. And so, who were these leading women? Well, they may or may not have been Jewish, they may or may not have been Christians, they may or may not have been godly, but these were women of money, women of influence, women of social standing. And some of them, the ones that had the good hearts, they helped to further the cause of Christ. So I hope that answers that question. It's a good question, not one that I have ever seen before.